The preamble to the Code of Ethics for the National Association of Realtors begins with, "Under all is the land. Upon its wise utilization and widely allocated ownership depend the survival and growth of free institutions and of our civilization." Have you ever wondered about your hometown and how it came to be? The history of the homes and the people on your street? Have you noticed differences between the neighborhoods we call home?
When you consider the definition of apartheid to be the intentional segregation of various communities based on race and ethnicity, it would be hard to argue that it's not.
I told you I was president of the real estate board. Most of this integration is lip service from people and the government. As a matter of fact, I didn't know of too many black people in Brighton. I had people call me up and say, "I understand you sold this house on Eison Avenue to a black person. And if that's the case, boy, you're never going to sell another house in Brighton again."
The process of moving to Rochester was scary. We initially did want to live in the city of Rochester, but it really couldn't work out where our two children would be in the same school at the same time. My sister-in-law looked at two houses. This was one of them. And when she came, she said, "You guys need to come immediately, put an offer on this house. I think it's right for you guys, for where you are and what you need." I don't seek out places where I am the only person of color. Just living in Meadowbrook and just walking around my neighborhood, it became clear that I was the only person of color that I had seen in the neighborhood. I guess as an adult and how I operate in the world, there's this idea of being seen, right? That people are seeing you, that they make eye contact with you, that you exist, that they say "excuse me" to you, that you're not invisible. And then moving to a small town like Rochester, immediately how invisible I felt. I didn't know why I felt so invisible or so overlooked. And then eventually I said, "Okay, what's going on? Like, something's up." And I'm like, "Oh, this is a racist town. Okay, they don't want to see me."
My neighborhood is very mixed. We have African Americans, we have Americans on the side, we have Dominicans on one side, we have Puerto Ricans here, and it's very mixed. Even though most of the time we don't talk to each other, when something happens, everybody gets together. We had shootouts from one side to another. The kids, my daughter won't go outside. She was like, "If I'm not outside, she ain't going outside." I want my daughter to be able to go outside and play. It's upsetting to me that 8-year-old, 9-year-old is worried about those things. I like living here, but at the same time, I don't want to. They see they're Hispanic or they have some type of help, like Section 8 or housing, and they're like, "Oh no, they're bad people." Automatically, there's a label on them. So it's you can't move to a better place unless you either buy a house or something, because you have such a bad reputation just because you're in the system. That's one of the reasons why I can barely move. I can't move from here.
My mom is everything in this house. She's the cook, the cleaner, the babysitter, the driver, the teacher, the counselor. She's the real reason this house is still standing. She's everything in this house.
Joshwan and his high school classmates produced a documentary on the legacy of segregation in Rochester, based on the history they learned from the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project.
Before the film, I knew nothing, no type of information about redlining. I figured through social media and everything that I've saw, there's always this tension between people of America. It's a history that we were not taught, but it's a history that we deserve to know. And it's a history that you shouldn't block out just because it was a dark part of this free and perfect America.
Starting after World War II, thousands of Black Southern migrants began arriving in Rochester, New York. They were fleeing oppressive racial discrimination in the South and hoped to find better conditions in the North, better jobs, better housing, better schools for their children. It didn't take long for them to realize that racism was a problem in Rochester, even if it looked different from what they were used to. The first clue likely came when they went looking for an apartment to rent or a house to buy. Almost all the Black Southern migrants who arrived in Rochester found a place to live in one of two neighborhoods: the 3rd Ward, also known as the Clarissa Street neighborhood, or the 7th Ward near Joseph Avenue.
As a matter of fact, there were many blacks who wanted to move out of certain blighted areas, but found that the realtors were not willing to assist them.
The wife and I answered ads to 69 ads for 69 apartments, and we were refused for all of them.
It wasn't a coincidence that Black people ended up in these two neighborhoods, and it wasn't just because they wanted to live near people like them. Instead, they were kept by a complex web of racist policies endorsed by the United States government and maintained by the city and county governments, the real estate and banking industry, and many others, even as the neighborhoods became overcrowded and dilapidated. One important policy was the National Housing Act of 1934 and dates back to the Great Depression. The federal government created programs to help people buy a house or stay in their home even if they were struggling to make their payments. But not every family or every house qualified for these programs. Instead, the government wrote rules and drew color-coded maps of cities like Rochester to determine where it would help people. Neighborhoods with mostly white people, including those in the suburbs, got color-coded green or blue. That means the government helped people buy houses, thereby insuring their mortgages. Over time, Rochester grew beyond simple Black and white demographics. Puerto Ricans began arriving in large numbers, followed by immigrants and refugees from Asia and Africa. Neighborhoods with Black people or people who were considered foreigners were colored red. Living in a red neighborhood meant the government was unlikely to help you buy a house or stay in your house. This became known as redlining. These redlined neighborhoods had been segregated before the federal government made the maps, but the maps made it clear that the United States was tolerating and even encouraging racial segregation. For example, the rules written by the government initially associated race with risk. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values. Natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences, including prevention of the infiltration of business and industrial uses, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. A high-speed traffic artery or wide street parkway may prevent the expansion of inharmonious uses to a location on the opposite side of the street.
If you look at those communities that had been redlined in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, those are those communities where we see more and more a concentration of poverty over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now into the 21st century. What that has created is a system by which we've created artificial barriers. And whenever you put an artificial barrier into place from a policy perspective, you change the ability of folks to engage in social and economic mobility.
To be most effective, deed restrictions should be imposed upon all land in the immediate environment of the subject location. Recommended restrictions should include provisions for the following: prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Of course, not everyone needed help from the government to buy a house, but even those people were prevented from buying houses in white neighborhoods by another policy called racially restrictive covenants. A covenant is an agreement. In a racially restrictive covenant, any person who buys a certain house agrees that when they sell it, they won't sell it to people of certain races or ethnicities. That often included Jewish or Polish people, but it always included Black and brown people. But until 1948, if a Black person somehow managed to buy a house with a racially restrictive covenant, they could be sued in court or forced to leave the house. The government, in other words, was using its enforcement power to uphold these racist agreements.
The county board of supervisors and the county administrator back in the 1930s were actively involved in pursuing restrictive covenants for towns, I believe in Irondequoit and in other places in Monroe County, that were codified in the local law. So, at the time, the county government was an active participant in this.
No one knows exactly how many there are, but researchers estimate that there are more than 10,000 properties in the Rochester area with racially restrictive covenants. This deed for the subdivision of Gatesville is an example of how local institutions legally agreed to racially restrictive covenants, including First Federal Savings and Loan Association, Gates School Board, Town of Gates, County of Monroe, Eastman Savings and Loan Association, Kodak Employees Association, and Rochester Savings Bank. Other institutions with known covenants in their deeds include the Roman Catholic Diocese of Rochester and Somerville Fruit Farms owned by the Wegmans family. At the time redlining and racially restrictive covenants were in effect, most people in the Rochester area, Black and white, lived in the city. That began to change when the government offered unprecedented help to white people to buy affordable houses and new developments in the suburbs.
It's really interesting. One of the communities that did have restrictive covenants in place was right in the 24th District, the Meadowbrook neighborhood of Brighton. That was a neighborhood that was planned out by Eastman Kodak and pulled together, but done so in a way that had, very deep restrictive covenants in it.
Meadowbrook, written or unwritten, has always been restricted. And in a market where a person can sell his property to whomever he so pleases, the seller usually having much regard, as they say, for their friends and former neighbors, are not going to sell to people who they think are going to evaluate or depreciate the property or make their friends and neighbors unhappy, so they sell it to attractive people. Many people today still will not knowingly sell to Jewish people or Black people.
This government support helped 35 million white families reach the middle class and pass wealth on to their children. How much wealth? In 2020, the median white American family has $188,000 in total wealth, compared to $24,000 for the median Black family. That's 7 times more wealth for a white family. Where does that wealth come from? About 75% of white families own a home, versus less than half of Black families. Home ownership represents wealth that families can borrow, sell, or pass down to their children. When the government denied people of color the opportunity to buy homes, they were denied the opportunity to build generational wealth the way white families have done. People of color weren't just kept from buying houses, they were being excluded from the American dream. This is how redlining and racially restrictive covenants continue to have an effect today.
I think we look around Brighton and see a very white town. No matter how much we want things to be different, I think we don't see integrated neighborhoods the way we'd like to. The topic of restrictive covenants came up quite a few years ago. And so it was probably about that time that my awareness kind of kicked in that maybe there was more here that could be learned about Brighton's position with this phenomenon. This is the Meadowbrook original deed for the Meadowbrook neighborhood. It says, "No lot or dwelling unit shall be sold to or occupied by a colored person."
So when I realized that there was actually a covenant in the deed for this home that we purchased, it was confirmation that these neighborhoods that developed, they were done by design, right? And not as naturally occurring experience where people just decided to live near people that either looked like them or same socioeconomic status. This proved to me that there was an effort by many groups of peoples and systems in order to segregate, lawfully at this time, segregate people based on race. So by learning about the covenants, they did not change the way I felt about where I live just because I think it's as American as apple pie. When CORD first started, it was a couple of neighbors that got together. We decided that, we're going to look in our deed and see what we can do and how we can make changes. CORD stands for Confronting Our Racial Deeds, and really was about the racist acts that were committed, in Meadowbrook and the Greater Rochester area. What we learned we could do is we can revoke this particular covenant from our deed and that we can amend it by putting our own language. And we decided that we would use the New York State Fair Housing language.
Now, therefore, it is mutually agreed as follows. Paragraph 12 of the restrictions is hereby revoked, rescinded, rejected, disavowed, and repudiated in its entirety. Paragraph 12 of the restrictions is hereby replaced with the following provision. The sale or occupancy of any lot or dwelling shall not be restricted on the basis of race, creed, color, disability, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, military status, age, sex, marital status, lawful source of income, or family status.
What have I seen as far as the change in the town since CORD initiative? I'm afraid not as much change as I would have liked to see. That I haven't seen other neighborhoods picking up the torch. I think a lot of the neighborhoods that haven't had restrictive covenants in their deeds, like Bel Air and Houston Barnard and some of the other neighborhoods, are kind of saying, "Phew, guess we dodged that one." But yet their neighborhoods are no more integrated than Meadowbrook. So I don't think there's been much change, disappointingly.
What will you do? We all have a voice and a choice to take action in our own community.
The Rochester Teen Film Festival is a celebration of youth filmmakers.
But maybe some of the most important films are those that educate us. The movie that won this year was The Unattainable Dream, Redlining in Rochester.
It was just an amazing moment to be in.
I wasn't expecting it the way it turned out. It turned out great. Very proud of him. I honestly saw a side of Joshuan that I never seen before.
Joshuan and his classmates produced an award-winning student documentary to educate others.
You could tell that everybody was glad that they were a part of it because you can see as like, I am a part of something that can possibly change the world.
Even though everything doesn't go as planned, you still have to keep going, have my kids, have my family, have everybody that depend on me. And I have to wake up, do breakfast, send the kids to school, make sure to go to work, and come home and do it all over again the next day.
Janita and her neighbors organized to confront racism in their deeds and advocate for an inclusive neighborhood.
If not now, then when, right? We could have put it off again. We need to get the law passed. Then what do we need to do to get that passed today?
This is a call to action. What will you do in your community?